How do you handle a full-size piece of plywood in a one-man shop when you haven't got a panel saw or a table saw the size of an aircraft carrier? Well, it's simpler than you might think. All you need is a few 2x4s, a few scraps of plywood, and a little ingenuity. Plywood, I'm convinced, is the product of an evil genius, or more likely several of them. Beginning in the late 18th century and early 19th century, three successive inventors, Samuel Bentham, Emmanuel Nobel, and John Mayo, all developed a way to take a tree apart and put it back together in flat sheets of layered veneers. Plywood, as it came to be called, was more stable than solid wood, and it was equally as strong across both the width and the length. That was the genius part. The evil part came in 1928 when plywood manufacturers began to issue this stuff in standard-sized sheets. 8 feet long and 4 feet wide if you live in America, and 2.4 meters by 1.2 meters everywhere else. The sizes are similar, and they're just big enough to make it difficult for one person to handle by themselves, and even more difficult to cut up accurately with standard woodworking tools. When I first began woodworking, I made ingenious use of the floor. I put my plywood on top of a piece of sacrificial particleboard, and then I set my circular saw to cut through the plywood and about 1/8 of an inch or a few millimeters into the particleboard. I'd cut the pieces bigger than needed, leaving at least one factory edge on each piece. Then I'd resaw them to the sizes needed on a table saw, using those factory edges as a reference to make them square and true. It was a lot of planning, a lot of resawing, a lot of up and down. And when I was down, the dogs wouldn't leave me alone. So, for the last 50 years, I have been building jigs that would allow me to handle sheet materials and cut them accurately while remaining upright. The result of all this research is 4 simple fixtures. There is a cutting grid that supports the sheet at a comfortable height for cutting. There is a carrier that allows me to move sheets by myself. A loader that lets me place the sheet on the grid or remove it with little effort, and a guide that enables me to make accurate cuts with no need to resaw. Let's start with the grid, since this is where most of the action happens. After I got tired of working on the floor, I quickly found that you can't simply cut plywood while it's resting on sawhorses because it droops in the middle. You need to build a grid to support the sheets along their length as well as their width. My solution was to make a pair of sawhorses with extra wide rails and cut the notches in the rails to hold several 2x4s. This creates a knockdown grid. It also provides you with a temporary work surface when you need it. Just set up the grid and put a sheet of particleboard on top. Another advantage is that the pieces are easily replaceable. When the grid gets too cut up, simply make new rails or buy new 2x4s. And incidentally, you do not have to make your sawhorses. This is a pair of well-used commercial sawhorses to which I have attached some 2x rails with spaces. You can guess what the spaces are for. This is particularly handy if you're working at a job site and you need an easily portable cutting grid. Simply unfold the legs, place some 2x4s in the spaces, and you have a cutting grid. Now that you have a way to cut plywood and other sheet materials, you need a way to get the sheets to it. Sheet materials are notoriously difficult for one person to carry, not just because they're heavy, but because they're bulky and awkward. This simple carrier will give you some much needed control. Set the carrier down near the center of the sheet, then lift one end, swing it sideways, and lower the edge into the cradle. If it doesn't balance right away, slide the sheet in the cradle towards the heavy side. Stop when it balances reasonably well. Grab the rope handle with one hand, put the other hand on the top edge of the sheet, and lift up. You should be able to carry the plywood with your arm straight, that is, the arm that holds the carrier. If you have to crook your arm to keep the plywood off the ground, shorten the rope. The carrier should be close enough to the sheet's center of gravity that you can raise and lower the corners by moving the hand that holds the top edge forward or back. You can carefully swing the sheet to the right and left simply by turning your body. I can tell you from experience that this jig does not make this sheet any lighter, but it does make it easier to manage. Once you've got the plywood to your cutting grid, you have to get the plywood off the carrier and onto the grid. This alone can be a Herculean task, which is why I have attached these loading arms to the ends of my sawhorses. Rest the sheet in the holders on the ends of the loading arms and remove the carrier. The pivots of the arms are positioned right at the sheet's lateral center of gravity. This allows you to tilt the sheet from vertical to horizontal almost effortlessly. Slide the sheet onto the grid and the loading arms will drop down out of the way so you can work. You can also use the arms to unload a sheet from the grid. Slide the sheet partway off the grid and raise one loading arm. Pull the sheet towards you until one corner catches the notch in the arm. Do the same with the other arm, then tilt the sheet back to vertical. It's now in a position where you can easily lift it off the arms with the carrier. This technique is useful if you need to flip the sheet of plywood over. I like to make my cuts with the good side facing down. You see, a circular saw cuts with the teeth rotating up, so you get a slightly cleaner cut on the side that faces down. The trouble is, this useful factoid is completely gone from my mind until right before I'm about to make a cut. Consequently, I only have a 50-50 chance of getting the right side up, that is, the good side down, every time I load the grid. So these loaders see quite a bit of use as unloaders. Once you have the plywood properly positioned on the grid, it's time to make a cut. Now, there are many fixtures that you can buy that will help you make a straight, accurate cut with a circular saw. But the fact is, you have exactly what you need on the edge of this plywood. The factory edge on a piece of good quality plywood is perfectly straight enough to serve as a saw guide. Rip a long strip from the edge of a 3/4 inch or 19 millimeters thick sheet, about 4 inches or 10 centimeters wide. Rip another long strip from a piece of 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter thick plywood. This should be as wide as the base of your circular saw plus 4 inches or 10 centimeters. Position the thick strip on top of the thinner one, about 3/4 of an inch or 19 millimeters from one edge, as shown. The factory edge should face in towards the far edge of the thinner plywood, which I'm going to call the base. The thicker plywood is the guide. Clamp the ends of the guide to the base and stretch a string along the factory edge. Clamp the entire length of the guide and the base together using the string to make sure that the factory edge stays perfectly straight. When the guide and the base are clamped together and you're satisfied that the factory edge is straight, draw a line along the factory edge on the base. Remove the clamps, apply glue to the adjoining surfaces, and clamp the guide and the base back together using the line as a reference to keep the factory edge straight. You can also use the string once again to check that the edge is true before the glue sets up. When the glue has cured for 8 hours or more, remove the clamps and trim the edge of the base with your circular saw, guiding it along the factory edge. You now have a saw guide that will help you make straight, accurate cuts, provided you follow 2 important rules. First of all, always use the same saw and the same blade to make the cuts as you use to trim it. And second, always keep the saw guide pressed firmly against the edge as you cut. Now you're probably thinking, if I press sideways too hard, won't the saw guide bow and the saw will cut an arc rather than a line? Well, in another universe that may be true, but there is one more thing that you can add to this jig that will prevent that potential problem. Let's set up to make a cut and I'll show you what I mean. We're going to trim the edge that I just cut freehand and make it perfectly straight with the guide. First, measure and mark where you want to cut. Stick a few strips of 50 grit sandpaper to the bottom side of the base all along its length. This is important. This is what keeps the guide from bowing during a cut, especially long cuts. Place the saw guide on the plywood, even up the trimmed edge with your cut marks, and clamp it in place. Remember that the saw guide rests on the piece you want to keep. Before you start cutting, adjust the depth of cut. You want just enough blade showing to cut through the material, plus 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters for the thickness of the base. With the saw off, carefully line up the circular saw with the guide. When you're ready, turn the saw on and cut slowly, carefully keeping the saw against the factory edge of the guide. How accurate is this jig? Well, provided you get the factory edge perfectly straight, it can be very accurate. I've used this system for dozens of cabinet installations, kitchens, bathrooms, offices, entertainment centers, workshop storage. The cabinets right behind me were made using a jig just like this. But one more important tip. The quality and the accuracy of your cuts don't just depend on your saw guide. You need to get yourself a blade that's made just for plywood and sheet materials. It should have at least 40 teeth. And if you look around, you can find carbide blades with 60 teeth and steel blades with 140 teeth. And once you've got a good blade, keep it sharp. A dull blade will drift in a cut no matter how good your saw guide may be. The plans for all of these jigs are available from our general store. The link is in the description, or you can press the button in the upper right-hand corner. And thanks for your time. I hope I've made a challenging task a little easier. At least I've gotten you off the floor.